Greed. The Buddha taught that greed is one of the three unwholesome roots, along with hatred and delusion, that bind us to the cycle of suffering. Although a greedy mentality has a harmful effect on the mind, most people are unaware of the danger. Many people want to know how to rid themselves of anger, because anger is an unpleasant emotion, but greed is regarded as a more friendly emotion. Because of that, people rarely ask me, how can I get rid of greed? Most people do not regard greed as wrong, even though it is also one of the three poisons that the Buddha declared keeps living beings mired in samsara. The nature of greed manifests as a perpetual state of wanting in the mind. When we observe closely, we see how this wanting creates a peculiar form of suffering, not just in the wanting itself, but also in the way it shapes our perceptions. Even after acquiring what it sought, the mind immediately seeks a new object of desire, proving that the problem lies not in what we lack, but in the habitual pattern of wanting. Consider how this inclination towards greed has been institutionalized in today's society. The marketplace relies on people's minds to be in a constant state of dissatisfaction. Even those who already have abundant material comforts still find themselves comparing their possessions to those of others, always discovering some new deficiency to fill. A person obtains a comfortable home, only to be disturbed by thoughts about those who have grander ones. They acquire a reliable car, yet their minds fixate on the more luxurious models that others drive. This system of continuous wanting has become so deeply embedded in our economic structures that we've convinced ourselves that fulfilling our desires is necessary for the economy's long-term survival. There's a widespread belief that without this endless cycle of greed and consumption, the social economy would unravel. Yet this belief arises from the same delusion that drives personal greediness, the notion that happiness comes from our acquisitions. The marketing industry skillfully exploits this basic misunderstanding. It doesn't just sell products, it sells the promise of fulfillment, suggesting that contentment lies just one more purchase away. Though our deeper wisdom recognizes this as false, the momentum of habitual greed often bypasses this insight. Like a fish caught on a hook, we're pulled along by the force of our own craving, even though we barely recognize the predicament we're in. The greedy mind is, at its core, a mind caught in the delusion of self-identity. It operates from the mistaken belief that personal happiness comes from acquisition and accumulation. I want this. I must have that. Those will make me happy. These thoughts arise continuously, driving behavior that ultimately does not lead to satisfaction, but instead surrenders to further craving. This mentality is inherently selfish because it views the world through the narrow lens of personal desire. Everything and everyone are evaluated based on what they can provide to satisfy one's wants. Other people are reduced to objects that either help or hinder the pursuit of personal gratification. This objectification of others is the very definition of selfishness, because it is the inability to recognize that all living beings share the same fundamental wish to be happy and free from suffering. The greedy mind tends to create a false sense of urgency. It convinces us that fulfilling this or that desire is of paramount importance. In this state of agitation, ethical considerations often become secondary. The mind acts with an attitude that says, I need this so badly that it doesn't matter how I get it, or who is affected. This shows how following greedy tendencies leads to harmful actions. Perhaps most insidiously, The greedy mentality is never satiated. When one desire is fulfilled, another quickly takes its place. Each satisfaction is temporary, leaving behind a residue of hankering for more. This endless cycle of craving for more is what the Buddha identified as the cause of suffering. Not the objects of desire themselves, but the mind's habit of never being contented with what it has. The Buddha's teachings provide us with precise tools for understanding the mechanics of greed and craving. When we begin examining the workings of our minds, we must learn to distinguish between several closely related mental defilements. In this respect, it is helpful to understand the distinction between greed, craving, clinging, grasping, and attachment. Although these terms are often used interchangeably, they actually point to different aspects of our relationship with greed. Greed operates as a basic conditioning factor in the mind. It functions almost automatically. We see something pleasant. We want it. We hear something agreeable. We want more. This happens without much sophistication or complexity. Greed is the raw material, the basic wanting that arises due to our habitual tendency to divide our experiences into those which are considered pleasant and those which are considered unpleasant. Greed manifests as a general acquisitiveness, as a leaning of the mind toward accumulation. Greed is like the soil in which the more complex forms of desire take root and grow. Without addressing this fundamental tendency, we cannot hope to overcome the suffering that arises from our more elaborate patterns of wanting. In our meditation practice, we might notice greed as the mind's preference for pleasant sensations. When sitting quietly, if we notice that the mind naturally inclines toward comfort and away from discomfort, this is an example of greed operating in its most basic form. It colors our experience before we even recognize that it's happening. Craving, or tanha, is more specific and dynamic than greed. While greed may be thought of as a general disposition, craving is an active force. The Buddha identified it specifically as the cause of suffering in the second noble truth when he said, "The origin of suffering is craving." In the Buddha's teachings, tanha appears in two important places: as what causes suffering in the second noble truth, and as one link in the chain of dependent origination. Although they might seem the same at first glance, these two aspects of craving are really quite different in their fundamental nature. When the Lord Buddha said, "The origin of suffering is craving," he was showing that craving isn't just a passing mental state that comes and goes with different experiences. Rather, it is a deep-seated condition that's built into the ordinary mind. We can see this is true for several reasons. The Four Noble Truths aren't just observations about how we feel sometimes. They are universal truths about the very nature of existence itself. The second truth points to craving as the cause of suffering, showing there's something fundamental about their relationship. To truly overcome craving, as described in the Fourth Noble Truth, requires more than just changing our behavior or controlling our impulses. It requires a complete transformation of the mind itself. This suggests that craving is woven right into the very fiber of conscious awareness. When we examine tanha in the context of dependent origination, we see it functioning differently than in the second noble truth. In Paticcasamuppada, tanha appears as one specific link in a chain of causation, not as the fundamental cause of all suffering. The formula states, "With feeling as condition, craving arises." This shows tanha to be a reaction that depends specifically on Vedana, suggesting it's more of a momentary response than an underlying characteristic of the mind. In the 12-link chain, Craving is simply one conditioned factor among many others, arising and passing away within a specific sequence. Craving doesn't hold the same foundational status here as it does in the Four Noble Truths. That's because Paticcasamuppada explains the mechanics of how suffering arises and ceases in a moment-to-moment process, while the Noble Truths are pointing to the essential framework that underlies all of samsaric existence. The Buddha spoke of three types of craving: craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, that is, wanting to be something, wanting continued existence, and craving for non-becoming, that is, a desire for something that cannot possibly be, as in the desire to escape from inevitable karmic consequences. Greed and craving, while often linked, have distinctive characteristics. While greed is generally understood as an excessive desire for material possessions or wealth, craving, specifically as a noble truth, represents a deeper and more fundamental form of insatiable hunger that extends beyond material desires. Craving has a restless quality about it. It is never actually satisfied. Even when we obtain the object of our craving, the satisfaction is fleeting, because craving simply drops it and presses ahead, searching for new objects. Craving is a deeply rooted aspect of human consciousness. It's not just about wanting things, but about the very nature of wanting itself. The Buddha stated that craving is one of the root causes of suffering and dissatisfaction. It represents not just material wanting, but the deeper existential cravings that drive human behavior, including our craving for life itself. In fact, the great wheel of samsaric existence is turned by the collective craving of all living beings. Each moment of greed propels the wheel of life and death around in continuous motion. If human consciousness were an ocean, greed would be like a particular wave pattern on its surface, while tanha would be like the underlying current that creates all waves. This current of tanha moves silently beneath the surface, shaping not just our worldly desires, but our entire relationship with existence. Greed can be modified or controlled through moral precepts and willpower, but tanha must be addressed by deep Dhamma practice and understanding, as it is fused into the very makeup of samsaric existence. Addressing tanha properly requires a fundamental revision of how we understand ourselves and our relationship to greed. This is not about simply calming the waves on the surface. It's about comprehending the entire ocean of awareness. Ajahn Mahabua often emphasized to us the relentless nature of craving. It is the force that drives the wheel of rebirth, pushing us from one state of becoming to another without rest. Craving is not just wanting. It is wanting with a forcefulness which propels the karmic actions that lead to future consequences. When we experience craving, we feel a persistent sense of incompleteness. It manifests as the perpetual thought that something is missing or something more is needed. This mental pattern applies not only to physical pleasures, but also extends to abstract concepts like status, recognition, and even spiritual attainments. The relationship between greed and craving also explains why material success often fails to bring lasting satisfaction. A greedy person might acquire everything he wants, only to find his burning thirst unquenched. This is because while greed can be temporarily satiated through acquisition, tanha cannot be appeased through any external means. Surmounting it requires a radical transformation of the inner workings of consciousness. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach human development and spiritual practice. Tackling greed might involve developing better mental habits, or practicing generosity or focusing on moderation. But addressing craving requires a deeper investigation into the nature of human consciousness, an undertaking that leads to the heart of Buddhist practice and to the possibility of genuine liberation from suffering. Upadana, what we call clinging, represents an intensification of craving. While craving is the initial inclination to reach out, clinging is the sustained holding on. The Buddha described 4 types of clinging: clinging to sensual pleasures, clinging to views, clinging to rules and practices, and clinging to notions of personal identity. Clinging has a more persistent quality than craving. It's not just the underlying thirst for something, but it's about developing elaborate strategies to obtain and keep it. It involves mental proliferation and constant planning. In practice, we can observe clinging when we become attached to particular meditative experiences. Perhaps we once experienced a profound state of calm, and now we sit down expecting to recreate it. We're no longer simply practicing meditation in the present moment. We're clinging to an idea of what our meditation should be like. In English translations of Buddhist texts, the term grasping is often used interchangeably with clinging to translate the term upadana. However, a distinction can be made. We can think of grasping as the physical or mental action that arises from clinging, that is, the active process of holding on. Grasping is clinging in motion. It's how we act based on our clinging mentality. We might grasp at opportunities, at relationships, at status, or at material goods. Grasping has a quality of manipulation and control. We try to arrange our experience to match our desires. We grasp at pleasant experiences, trying to prolong them. We grasp at unpleasant experiences, trying to push them away. Clinging has a quality of identification. We begin to define ourselves through what we cling to. I'm a person who has this view, or I am a person who experiences these pleasures. One might also grasp at attainments or insights in meditation. This identification strengthens the illusion of self, creating the conditions for further suffering. The word attachment is also used in a similar Buddhist context. Attachment can be understood as the emotional investment that accompanies clinging. While not the direct translation of a specific Pali term, it conveys the emotional dependence we develop toward objects, people, ideas, and identities. Attachment involves a concrete sense of ownership and identification. This is mine. This is me. This is what I am. This possessiveness creates conditions for suffering because everything we identify with and claim ownership of is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. In daily life, attachment manifests as the pain we feel when separated from what we love, or when forced to confront what we don't like. In meditation, it appears as identification with states of mind and our interpretation of them. We might take the attitude that I am a good meditator, or I am failing at meditation. None of the above factors, from greed to attachment, exists in isolation. Rather, they are links of a chain that contributes to the process of suffering. Greed provides the basic disposition toward wanting. Craving is the basic underlying force that's never satisfied. Clinging develops a sustained attachment to the objects of our desires. And grasping manifests as the actions we take based on our clinging to attachments. Since the Buddhist path is gradual, at first we might notice the more obvious forms of greed and craving. As our practice deepens, we become sensitive to subtler forms of clinging, particularly to wrong views and a sense of self-importance. Eventually, all these tendencies are seen for what they are, not as who I am, but simply as conditioned phenomena arising and passing away. I encourage you to become familiar with these different qualities of wanting when they arise in your meditation practice. Notice how greed colors the background of consciousness, how craving propels the mind toward or away from experiences, how clinging causes the mind to become entangled with its objects, and how grasping creates tension and dissatisfaction. By developing this level of wisdom, we'll begin to see more clearly how suffering is created and sustained. We'll notice the gaps between stimulus and response, where relief can be found. As mindfulness strengthens, we'll catch the process unfolding earlier and quicker, eventually undermining the strong roots of greed in the mind. As our practice deepens, we'll move beyond conceptual understanding to direct knowing. We'll see these processes clearly, not because we've memorized the definitions, but because we've observed them for ourselves in our own experience. But keep in mind that these processes never stand still. Our thoughts and actions flow in an endless stream, like a river that never rests at any single point. Even when we get what we think we want, a new wanting quickly takes its place. Each satisfied desire gives birth to fresh desires, creating a cycle that's constantly spinning out of control. Think of how one thought leads to another. A memory triggers a worry, which sparks a plan, which then fuels an action. Each mental state feeds the next, like a flame passing from one candle to another. Our thoughts hunger for expression, and once expressed, they hunger for results. These results then produce new thoughts, and new hungers arise. We might imagine we can eventually find total satisfaction, a place of complete rest. But the nature of this process tells us otherwise. Each fulfillment is temporary. Each satisfaction gives way to new yearning. Understanding this helps us see why lasting happiness can't come from chasing ceaseless craving, but can only be found in understanding the true nature of craving. Greed is constantly reaching out to obtain something that is not worth having. Greediness begins with the false premise that happiness comes from acquisition and accumulation. The greedy mind believes, if I can just have this, I will be content. But as those who have walked the Buddhist path know well, once that object is obtained, the mind quickly shifts its attention to the next desire. This illustrates the nature of craving. It is never satisfied. The selfishness inherent in greed is particularly destructive because it reinforces the illusion of a separate self that must be protected and enriched at all costs. When we are caught in this mentality, we see the world as divided into that which is mine and that which is not mine. We grasp what we want and push away what we don't want, all in service of this imagined self. In the practice of Dhamma, we learn to observe this process with wise attention. We see how greed arises and how it manifests in the body as tension and in the mind as restlessness. We notice the suffering that accompanies it, the anxiety of wanting, the fear of losing, and the disappointment when things don't meet our expectations. The Buddha offered several antidotes to the greedy mentality. He said that the path beyond greed begins with generosity. When we give freely of our possessions, our time, and our kindness, we actively weaken the grip of me and mine. We experience the joy that comes from benefiting others rather than just ourselves. Generosity is not merely a moral virtue, it's also a practical training that directly counters selfish impulses and leads to a feeling of happiness. Core Buddhist values such as contentment with less and a commitment to moderation also act as antidotes to greed. The Buddha repeatedly taught that contentment with little is a blessing, while greed for more is a curse. Contentment allows us to appreciate what we have instead of obsessing over what we lack. Moderation breaks the cycle of greed by helping us recognize when we have enough, which is that point of sufficiency where mind and body are properly maintained without excess. When we commit to moderation, we train ourselves to distinguish between genuine needs and unnecessary wants. Both contentment and moderation help loosen the grip of self-centeredness that fuels the greedy mentality. When we begin Buddhist meditation, we naturally start with the more visible aspects of the practice: moral restraint, moderation in daily life, and the development of mindfulness of our reactions to sense impressions. These practices are indeed essential, and the Buddha emphasized them for good reason. They create the necessary foundation for the spiritual journey. Without them, the mind remains too agitated, too pulled by the world to settle into the deeper work. However, we must understand that these preliminary practices, while necessary, are not sufficient for the attainment of complete liberation. Many people make the mistake of believing that if they simply refrain from harmful actions, live moderately, and become more aware of their reactions to sensory experiences, they will eventually reach the end of suffering. But it's not so simple as that. The practice must go deeper. True understanding requires a penetrating insight into the nature of conscious awareness itself. It means we must transform not only what we're aware of, the objects of consciousness, but the very way in which awareness operates. Consider how ordinary consciousness functions. When we see a form, hear a sound, or think a thought, there is a reaction of like or dislike. This is the point where greed, clinging, grasping, and attachment take an active role as reactions to these stimuli. They act like waves on the surface of awareness, responding to the flow of the deeper, more powerful current of craving. The power of craving far exceeds conventional notions of greed or attachment. It manifests as a profound and pervasive current, flowing through the depths of our consciousness, always reaching beyond what is present, forever reaching towards something else. Consequently, the mind is always leaning forward, mentally projecting us towards the next moment, the next experience, or the next acquisition. Craving has permeated awareness with such strong, unfulfilled desire that by nature it can never actually get what it wants, and, by extension, appears to get what it does not want. Craving operates as a system that permeates every aspect of our consciousness and shapes how we engage with reality itself. This force, subtle in its operation yet immensely powerful in its effects, perpetually conditions our emotional states, coloring every perception that arises in awareness. To illustrate how this all-pervasive craving never ceases, even when we're sleeping, craving continues to flow at the subliminal level of sleep consciousness, affecting the quality of our sleep, the content of our dreams, and the mood we wake up in. Craving's underlying dissatisfaction sets the tone for every conscious moment. The influence of craving extends into every corner of our experience, creating distortions in how we apprehend the world. It acts as an ongoing state of being, so infused into our mental processes that we rarely recognize its presence. Like water to a fish, it is the very medium through which we interpret and relate to all phenomena. This craving nature operates with remarkable sophistication, adapting itself to every circumstance, and cloaking itself in countless guises, sometimes appearing as an obvious desire for sensual pleasures, but most often manifesting in far more refined forms, as subtle preferences, as barely noticeable aversions, as the very sense of selfhood that we take for granted in our moment-to-moment experience. The Buddha identified craving as the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, precisely because it functions so fundamentally within our psychological makeup. It is the invisible current that flows beneath the surface of all our thoughts, speech, and actions. What makes craving so insidious is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness. Yet it determines how we construct meaning and value in every moment. It is the gravitational force that shapes the sentient universe, pulling all experiences into orbit around an illusory sense of I and mine. Until we develop penetrative mindfulness and wisdom, we remain unconscious participants in this process, believing that the things we desire are simply out there in the world, rather than recognizing that the desire is a projection of our own craving nature.